30th July is observed by the UN as the World Against Trafficking in Persons Day. This year's theme was Reach Every Victim of Trafficking, Leave No One Behind. We are living today in a world of chaos, conflict, and crisis. From pandemic driven extreme poverty to traumatizing wars and climate emergencies. As millions of people get displaced annually, the inequalities leave hundreds of thousands at risk of exploitation by human traffickers. And today, on episode 10 of the Foreign Policy podcast, Beyond Nation and State on Suno India, we will talk about the scale of this crisis in South Asia in particular. Hi, everyone. I'm Smita Sharma, an independent journalist and your host for this podcast series. New episodes drop every Wednesday, and you can tune in to all our conversations on the Suno India app as well as the Apple and Spotify podcasts. Now, a quarter of the world's population lives in South Asia, with India now, of course, top of the charts with 1.4 billion people and counting. My namesake and a celebrated photojournalist, Smita Sharma, documented the human trafficking network and crisis across South Asia in her very powerful book, We Cry in Silence. Now, this book, We Cry in Silence, and I have a copy of this for those of you who will be able to watch the video segment of this podcast later. It is an extremely powerful book with its graphics, with its illustrations that I will be talking to Smita about it, in this conversation, of course. And this book documents the trafficking of underage girls across South Asia. It has won the Photography Book of the Year Award of Excellence by Pictures of the Year International. It was also listed in top 10 photo books by the International Center of Photography. And I also highly recommend Smita's earlier TED Talk at Palm Springs, California. The link is provided in this podcast, description. Smita, thank you so much for joining in here on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Smita.
And as we always joke that Farhan Akhtar really needs to make a sequel of his film Smita Sharma Calling Smita Sharma. There you have it, both of us on audio and video together. Smita, let me begin by asking you, because this is a book, this is a project that took you almost 7 years to complete. Did you really start off with any one particular country, destination in mind, and then things started to add up, or you expanded it to South Asia eventually?
To be very honest, when I started this project, I didn't even think of it as a project. It was more of a shock after I met the 17-year-old girl, who I shall call Meena. And she was just rescued from the red light area in Delhi and brought back home in the South 24 Parganas. And as most of us assume, trafficking involves men, and it takes a lot of time for them to woo the girl, to trap them. But her story was pretty unique because she received a random phone call from a guy who called himself Raj and asked her out on a date. The day they met, he came with gifts, and then he mentioned about his sister who ran a business in Delhi, and then he proposed marriage. And an hour later, his parents joined them, and this couple presented Meena with a sari saying they wanted her to be a part of the family. She never went back home that day. Instead, she walked with him. They went to Calcutta, boarded a train, and left for Delhi, and the rest is history. So, this story was very shocking because I couldn't understand how is it possible for a girl to just walk away with a stranger she just met. And that was the beginning of this investigation. To answer your question about expansion, I never thought of expanding. It was all about research and going deeper. And as I went deeper, I realized that it's much bigger than what I had imagined. And India is both the source as well as the destination country, while Nepal and Bangladesh are both source countries, which means girls are brought in through the border, smuggled mostly into India, and then they are sent into various red light districts across the country.
Hmm. We will talk about the challenges in each of these countries in a little bit more detail, Smita. But before I talk about the book, let me also go back to your photojournalism career prior to this project. What were the choices of your subjects like then? You have worked with a lot of international organizations, including the National Geographic magazine, the New York Times. Was it a subject that was always close to your heart that you had already been working on?
I think the answer will be about my childhood because I grew up in a small town called Shillong. While I was growing up in the late 80s and 90s, there was a lot of racial tensions, violence, ethnic conflict. And these stories never came out in the national newspapers. And when we would go out for holidays and when we would tell people about what was going on, nobody had a clue. So, this impacted me as a child because there was this feeling of isolation and neglect. Perhaps that's the reason why I prefer to work on underreported stories, and I'm aligned to working on gender, social issues, human rights violations, and most of my work has been centered around these. Whether it is in India or whether it is in the other countries in the global south.
So, when you started working on human trafficking in particular, gender violence, sexual discrimination, what were the initial challenges you faced, and how did you work around them to find a path to keep moving forward despite the many hurdles I'm sure which you would have faced?
To be very honest, while working on this project, I had also been working on sexual violence and rape in India. My earlier project, which is called Not My Shame. So, through that experience of working in that project, I already had connections with some law enforcement agencies and also with some of the nonprofits who are working for girls. So, those were the first people that I went to for help and support. And of course, there was a lot of hurdles, especially law enforcement. I'm sure you can imagine it's not easy, especially in our country, right, to get that access. So, if you look at my book, there is a section there where I show stories about traffickers. So it's not easy to actually go and speak to traffickers, those who have been arrested or detained for, and it took me 3 years to get there, just to get that access with the police. And in concern to the survivors who are brought back home, whether it is you know in the villages or whether they were at shelter homes, even that took time because nobody would trust me. And of course, I understand they have gone through horrific experience, traumatic, and so it took some time to develop that kind of relationship. And
Hmm.
honestly, I never carry my camera when I don't take out my camera at the first meeting or anything. It's a process. It takes time to build that connection. It happens gradually, and I'm very honest when I approach the people and I explain it to them. What is my purpose? Why am I here? And what is
Hmm.
my objective? And people do understand, when you speak to them. And there have been parents who have told me that we couldn't save our daughter. uh, you know
Hmm.
she went into this mess, she had a horrible time, and now she's back home. Maybe her story can prevent someone else's daughter from falling into this trap.
Hmm. I think those are very important words of wisdom for aspiring photojournalists from somebody who's internationally acclaimed because of her work. But, just that one point that you said that it took you 3 years to even get the confidence, especially of police and the legal authorities. Where do you think that mistrust was stemming from? Was it simply a denialism on their part of it? Or was it more to do with sort of gender discriminations and barriers even within the forces, within these institutes themselves, that they don't perceive a woman photojournalist as somebody who should be trusted enough?
Such an important question, Smita. uh, First, I would say that, the junior officers in the police stations, whenever you go and ask them about any missing report, any missing girls, they always tell you that there are no missing girls on your face. And they just want you to go. I'm giving you one example. There was one girl's family that I met by accident. Her aunt approached me, and I went to their family. The daughter was missing for 4 months, and the mother asked me, "Please help. I want my daughter back. I know there's something bad has happened to my daughter." So I took the copy of the FIR and a copy of a photograph, and I went to the police station. I did not show the documents I had. And then I asked the officer in charge, "Are there any missing reports in your, in your station? I'm working on this project." And he denied. And and then I took out the FIR, I showed it to him, and his first reaction was, "Oh, this is a love story. She must have eloped and got
Mm.
married." So this is the first reaction of most police officers. They always think that it is, elopement. It is a love story, so we should not interfere. But let me tell you, 90% of trafficking that happens is mostly promises of jobs and promises of marriage.
Mm.
90%. It's not what we think about kidnapping. Kidnapping hardly happens.
Mm.
And I think the senior police officers, the IPS officers who are more educated and who are more sensitized, they are the ones who understood me when I approached them. And I
Mm.
also showed them examples of my previous work. So that helped because, when you get the permission from above, it's easy for
Mm.
you to get access. So that's how I embedded with them on rescue operations and on patrolling. But again, it took time. And I had I was very lucky to be given access to the Mathurapur police station when one of the notorious criminal, Farak Ali, was arrested. Uh,
Mm.
and, I mean, right now he has been convicted. At that point of time, it was just 3 days after his arrest. He was still in
Mm.
police custody. And I got a call saying that we have got Farak ultimately because we were trying to catch him for more than 6 months. So they said, "Ma'am, can you come?" I said, "Yes." And I immediately went.
Mm.
And luckily, I was not far away. I was just 3 hours away. So I went and then I spoke to him. There was absolutely no remorse. And I just wanted to understand the psychology behind the traffickers. What leads them to trafficking? Why do they do it? And honestly, I've met women and men both who are in this. It's not just the men.
Is it just the money?
Yes. It is poverty, desperation, unemployment, so many factors. It's a very complex situation. If there's a man who is 25-year-old, he's staying at home, he doesn't have a job, he's out of school, he never got the money to pursue his education in college, and then he goes looking for jobs and he doesn't get anything. So there's a frustration that is built up. And then
Mm.
somebody approaches you and tells you that I'm going to give you 20,000 if you get me three girls.
Mm.
So
But
it is that.
did you face this kind of an attitude and a temperament in other countries also that you worked in, be it in Nepal, in Bangladesh? I think you worked in Sri Lanka too.
I haven't worked in Sri Lanka, but I did work in Nepal and Bangladesh. Uh, Again, I got the support from the non-profits, anti-human trafficking non-profits organizations who are working. Again, the behavior of the police is pretty similar, especially if you're a foreigner, then they look at you from a different eye. What is your business in our country? Why are you asking questions? So all those things
Mm.
are there. But if you accompany them, if you're accompanied by somebody local, uh, especially somebody who is from the nonprofit and who knows them, then things get easier. And situation is again pretty similar in those countries because I would say it is worse there. uh,
Mm.
Both the countries because of the again density of population, similar problems that we have here. Girls are very vulnerable. Parents are desperate for looking for opportunities to send their children away for work so that they can get some money. So, and of
Mm.
course the families are very large, very very large families.
So, do you feel like there is something very unique about this complexity in South Asia compared to other parts of the world? Or is this a more dangerous scale that we are talking about? How does South Asia compare globally when it comes to human trafficking?
Human trafficking exists, unfortunately, in every country, including the US, the most powerful country, right? It's happening there too. It's just that the way it happens is a little different. In certain countries in the global north, uh, girls are, you know, uh, most likely they are given drugs, they are made addicts in many cases, and then they are forced into sexual slavery. And of course there are a lot of other situations, families that has some kind of complication, broken families, children from there, they are very susceptible, they are vulnerable. And Also, if you look at countries in the Eastern Europe, Bosnia, all those countries which has had conflict in the past, it's very similar to South Asia also. Girls are promised jobs, mostly jobs, promises of
Mm,
jobs, either in France or in Germany or some other country, and then there are these middlemen who say that we are employers. We take girls from here and we will put you in hotels, and travel agencies come with us. So again, the modus operandi is quite similar. There
mm.
is, and the vulnerability is the same.
Right. Just to put some data out there for our listeners, the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, which is issued by the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, UNODC, it provides a global assessment on the scope of human trafficking, what is being done to fight it. Now, the 2022 report, which is available on its website, it is based on data from 141 countries, and it says that amid the pandemic, the number of victims detected globally fell by 11% in 2020 compared to the previous year. It was, of course, driven by few detections in low and medium income countries. The pandemic also may have weakened law enforcement capabilities to detect victims, which resulted in 27% lesser convictions worldwide. Your thoughts, Smita, on how the pandemic impacted the marginalized in particular when it came to human trafficking.
I think the pandemic just fueled it. People were more desperate. People had become poorer, they had little resources. Overnight, people lost jobs. And it's just not India, it's globally, in many countries, right? So if you look, and any sort of disaster, any sort of conflict, any sort of emergency always gives rise to these issues, whether it is, trafficking, or whether it is child marriage, uh, or even climate change. For example, the Nepal earthquake that happened in 2015, human trafficking just exponentially rose after that. In the months after the earthquake. And Bangladesh, the problem with Bangladesh is the annual flooding, the cyclones, and people losing their lands and homes to sea level rise. So, what do people do? They don't have homes, they lose their cattle, they don't have anywhere else to go. So, they migrate to larger cities and they are looking for jobs. And if they have 4 children, 5 children, they have to all cramp up and stay in one room. And then if somebody comes to you and says that I'm going to give jobs to your children, please send them with me, and here, take this 5,000. Parents just give their children away, and this is what's happening. So the global report, the statistics that you mentioned, I think there are a lot of underreported cases. There are so many of these numbers that should be much higher than what it is mentioned, because cases are not even reported.
Absolutely. Which I have actually turned on to a page of yours in this book, which has a photograph and it says year 2017. And if we were to turn back at the photograph, it reads photograph of R18 from police files. R went missing during her commute to college from the Kakwip region in 2017, and many more such powerful cases documented. Smita, we cry in silence. It's a very complex project. You provide photo evidence, visual evidence of the dark, this multi layered complex world of trafficking. And what is most important is, I think, you give a face to the millions of faceless victims while maintaining their dignity. So, how did you go about making sure that the faces that you were projecting, they had that human side to them, they had their dignity intact?
Very important question. Because it's visual journalism, our jobs is to, uh, show a narrative through visuals, right? And I had a lot of bindings while working on this project because of relevant laws in India, the POCSO, the protection. Can I say this again?
Yes, sure, sure. Protection of children from sexual offenses.
Offences Act.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm just going to start from
Mhm.
because it's visual journalism. Our jobs is to narrate stories visually, and because it's such a sensitive issue, and there are a lot of legal boundaries, so I had to work within those boundaries. For example, in India, we have the POCSO, which is the Protection of Children Against Sexual Offences Act, which says that you cannot reveal the identity of a minor of sexual crime in any form. And it's just not the face, even the location of the house, you cannot give it away because people should not be able to identify the girl, the survivor, or the victim. So, with all these boundaries, when my work is visual, I had to look for various methods to creatively use. So, I used a lot of tiny lights, I used shadows. Shadows became my best friend. And if you look at the images, you'll see that the girls' faces are not seen, but you can see their body language, you can see their personality. So it was very important for me to show their personality. And the only place where I was allowed to show their faces is the red light area, the brothels, because they chose to show their faces. So uh, I always gave them the choice whether they wanted to show their face or not. And
Mm,
for minors, of course, I had to maintain that anonymity. And there is no such law as per POCSO in Bangladesh or Nepal. It's not that strict, But I maintain the same
mm,
anonymity in the entire project because it's not just about the law, but it's also about as girls there is so much of shaming stigma. I didn't want
mm,
to take their chances of going to college or getting married because
mm,
of my work, because ultimately photographs are permanent evidence, right? 50 years down the line, I'm not going to be there, but the photographs are going to remain. What and 5 years down the line, I'm just saying that there are a lot of ways of sharing media these days, whether it is through social media, WhatsApp. So uh, I didn't want my work to be misused, and I didn't want my images to be used as a reason to shame them or the take away
mm.
their dignity. So that's why I always was very careful while working on this.
Right. And I think, again, those are very important lessons. And I've always firmly believed that you can only do good journalism and good storytelling if you have empathy and sympathy and you care enough. And, just to explain to some of our listeners who are tuning into this audio podcast, there are images, for instance, of this young girl who has two pigtails, long hair in a red kurta. She's holding on to a red tulip, and it's a shaded image with her face not seen. Another image of a woman who is against a floral backdrop, who's holding a bunch of flowers, but of course, that face has not been shown as well. And a lot of use of shadow and images, and something that you can see once you have this book in hand. But also for the unversed, Smita was referring to POCSO. Trafficking in human beings or persons, remember, is prohibited under the Constitution of India, under Article 23, Section 1. The Immoral Traffic Prevention Act 1956, or ITPA, is the premier legislation for prevention of trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation. We have several other laws in place, including the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences, or POCSO Act 2012, which came into effect from 14th November 2012, once we saw that horrendous Nirbhaya, in fact, rape case, gang rape case happen. POCSO, remember, is a special law to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation. There are a lot of other specific legislations enacted relating to trafficking in women and children, Prohibition of Child Marriage Act, there is Bonded Labor System Act, Child Labor Prohibition and Regulation Act, there is Transplantation of Human Organs Act. So we have a lot of layered legislations in place, Smita. If our trafficking still continues at mammoth levels, where do you find the main problem lying in?
I think poverty and desperation. If you don't have food on the table, you are not going to think um, you know, about anything else other than how do I get food on the table. It's hunger. So that makes people desperate. And at the end of the day, even when I spoke to mothers who are traffickers, and when I asked them, why did you do it? You're a mother, you have a child, and you have a daughter. What if the same happened to your daughter? And she's like, I did not think about all that. All I wanted was money so that I could send my children to school, so that I could buy food and clothes for them. So I think as long as there is this growing population and there is lack of opportunities, trafficking is not going to stop,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
That's the harsh truth. But in terms of legislations, we were talking about them. We need to remember that India has also ratified the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, which is the UNCTOC, which has one of its protocols: prevention, suppression, punishment of trafficking in persons, particularly women and children. India has also ratified the SARC Convention on Preventing and Combating Trafficking in Women and Children for Prostitution. This was a regional task force that was constituted to implement the SARC Convention, which drives me to my next question, Smita, that, keeping in mind the politics of India and Pakistan that overshadowed SARC as an institution. The regional organization has gone into limbo. I don't see any time soon that it can be revived. Uh, does that then impact what could have been done perhaps under the South Asian banner, with countries coming together collectively on the subject?
I think so. If there is no discussion, how can you progress towards uh, anything? I mean, even to make the simplest of change, you need to sit down and talk and discuss the problems, because every country has their own unique problems, right? So if you don't know what's happening in the background, how can you implement changes? How can you bring development? There has to be that discussion. So absolutely, it has impacted, I'm sure, at some level. And uh, I mean, if we speak about law enforcement, there are agencies like the Anti-Human Trafficking Unit, right, AHTU, and every police station, they are assigned to this unit. So the government, it's not that the government is sitting. There are a lot of provisions which are being actions which are being taken, but I think it's not enough, because the trafficking is a vast and very complex nexus. And traffickers are very smart. They are
Hmm.
extremely smart. They're using gadgets. They are on top of the game when it comes to using technology, especially after the pandemic. They have started using technology, and then now there is the dark web which they are using. So it's not simple. As times have changed, trafficking, the mode of trafficking is also changing, and it's
Hmm.
changing fast. So, to keep up
Absolutely.
with that, the government needs to sit down on policies, on changes to tackle that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are bilateral mechanisms, but I think collectively, what a South Asia as regional organization together can do on this subject will be way more important. We need to keep our politics aside when it comes to these subjects related to human rights, of human trafficking, also of climate emergencies there. We see this huge complex problem in Southeast Asia too. Southeast Asian
Mm.
countries are also trying to deal with this. Smita, you mentioned about, of course, the story of Nina, that was shocking to you and in a way started off your project. Tell us one or two more instances where it completely altered you as a human being when you came across those families, the people who were affected.
So, I in this project, I also worked on domestic servitude trafficking, which means trafficking girls, especially from the tribal or the indigenous communities. for domestic work. And this also was a little shocking because when I asked the traffickers why they go to certain areas to get girls and why not the other regions, their answer was pretty, pretty, I would say, surprising and I would say shocking because they said those girls are dark.
Mm.
Those girls are dark, they are skinny, no one is going to pay for them. So there is racism in the sex trade also, you know. So
Mm.
if you look at girls from Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Assam, all the tribal areas, girls from these areas, they are trafficked by so-called placement agencies, who are
Mm.
basically traffickers. They go to this village, they will get somebody local from there to help them. They'll give this local agent some money and they'll say, bring me 10 girls from your
Mm.
community. And each family is given just a token money, and the girls are brought into the big cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Hyderabad. And these girls are put into private households to work as domestic maids. So people like you and me who go to these agencies, we don't do enough groundwork because we are not aware of it. And there's no
Mm.
legislation as such for placement agency. There needs to be a regulation. Anyone can open a placement agency. It's very easy. You
Mm.
just have to fill up certain forms and register yours. It's very simple. And what you do is that, you go to find a nanny for your home, and then they'll give you a form. You fill up the form, for which is an agreement of 11 months. You pay them upfront. The
Mm.
entire money is pocketed by them. Sometimes the money never
Mm.
reaches the girls, and you feel, I have already paid. So this girl is coming to my house, and I have done nothing wrong because you're not aware of it. So this is an
Mm.
area which needs regulation. This is very important because there's a
Mm.
lot of violations that is happening, and a lot of girls are also being abused in domestic, work. Very
Mm.
recently, there has been one incident in Delhi, and there are many incidents where you see young girls being brought in and put into private homes. And as
Mm.
regards to any of the stories of these girls, there is one girl who I'll call S. She
Mm.
was 12. She was from Narayanganj in Bangladesh, and her mother had died, and her father had remarried. So she was not treated properly at home. So she met somebody who said, I'm going to get you a job in a beauty parlor in Dhaka. Come with me. She went
Mm.
with him, and from Dhaka, she was handed over to a middleman, and this middleman smuggled her into India. So from West Bengal, she was taken to Mumbai, where she was enslaved for 6 months. And every day she had to entertain 20 to 25 customers. And sometimes she told me that during Ganpati, during festivals, the numbers would increase to 40. And then
My
she told
God.
me that, Didi, there were times when I could not get up from my bed. We would have to go at 3 in the afternoon and we would get done by 5 in the morning. And my entire
Mm.
body felt so heavy, sometimes I would bleed, and they would not give us medication. And if we refused to entertain customers, we would be starved. And
Mm.
this happened every day, every single day. Imagine
Mm.
every single day you have to have sex with 20 people, sometimes up to 40. And she was rescued after 6 months and brought to a shelter. And later she met a woman who promised to take her back to Bangladesh. This woman re trafficked her and sold her to another brothel in West Bengal. So when
Oh my God.
I met her at a shelter when she was finally rescued for the second time. And when I asked her some questions, because she had a lot of marks on her hand, and when I asked her, what are these marks? She said, there was a time when I felt disgusted with myself. I felt I was unclean. So I just harmed myself. It felt good.
I think, some of this was very powerfully captured in the film Urta Punjab, for people who have seen that movie. But Smita, when you said that, of course, there are people who go to these agencies to hire domestic helps and they are not aware. Is this lack of awareness, a lot of it willing? because it is easy, it is convenient, because there is a government response to issues, but there is also that socio-cultural response or the
Hmm.
indifference or lack of it. Do you see, perceive a lot of it in Nepal, in India, in Bangladesh?
To be very honest, there sometimes I'm asked this question as to why I work on such things, and by very educated people. Like, don't you feel exhausted while working? And and they all want to help. And then I ask them that if you, I ask them that if given a chance, will you keep any of these girls who are rescued and who are given the medical attention once they are, you know, they are released from these shelter homes? Are you willing to keep them with you in your home to help you and give her some kind of employment opportunity? Nobody wants to. That kind of stigma is there, and people think that I don't want her to be close to my child. She's gone through all those trauma, and I don't know what kind of influence she's going to have on my children. I don't want her in our home. So people, even if they intend to, nobody wants to face it. Nobody wants to really help in the real sense. And in terms of placement agencies and maids, I think there's a lack of awareness. People are not aware of it. As I told you earlier, they just sign the agreement and they think it's legal. I've done the right thing. They're not aware how these girls are brought, what's their situation, where does the money go that they're paying. They're not aware of it, and they don't ask questions because they don't know.
So, how do you verify the credibility of an agency that you're approaching, Smita?
I think the first thing is that you speak to the girl that you want to hire and ask her where she's from, how she was brought. Take the phone number of her parents if they have, maybe have a word with the parents and find out uh, whether there was anything fishy or whether it's all transparent. And also, if you're paying the salary, don't pay the salary to the placement agency. Pay to the girl directly, or open a bank account and on her name and pay it there so that the money is hers. Don't pay it to the placement agency. They, of course, will take a commission. Every placement agency takes a commission. If it's a commission, that's okay because they're doing a job, they need to run. But you don't have to pay the salaries to the placement agencies.
Please, for all those tuning in, do make notes, make sure that you do your bit in this very complex human trafficking dark world to ensure that you fight it out in your own ways as an educated individual. Finally, Smita, for the very few young girls, you just cited a case where this girl was, of course, rescued, but then she is brought back again into the trafficking circle by another woman. For the victims who do manage to break free from the trafficking clutches, how do you see the support systems that exist? Are they welcomed back by their own families? How do they integrate into society?
Smita, there were some families I met in Bangladesh. The family members themselves traffic their own relatives. Sometimes the families are involved too. And that's the truth. It's not just strangers. Sometimes there is an aunt or an uncle. Sometimes it's even the parents who sell their daughters. So, where do the girls go? Where do they get that support and care? So, the shelter homes, the government agencies, the non-profits, they play a huge role in this. Whether it is legal support, providing trauma care, whether it is giving them some source of employment, training them in sewing or hairstyling, because there are these, they have these workshops for these girls so that at least they can earn a living if there is a situation where they cannot go back home. And girls who go back home, there are many families I met. Again, it's a gray area. There are families who welcome the girls, who are very happy that the girls are back, but they are in a rush to get the girls married. They don't think about their education. They think that let me just get rid of her. I just don't want to deal with it anymore. And then there are families who support their daughter's education. It's all about sensitizing them. And I have to commend the work of these anti human trafficking, very grassroots level, small organizations who work on the ground, because they are the ones who speak to the families, convince the parents. Sometimes they even arrange for funds to pay for the daughter's education because the families
Mm,
don't have money. So these are all important things. And also, the stigma and shaming is huge. If a girl goes missing from a home for a year and then she's back, there is bound to be gossip,
true.
especially in suburbs and villages. Everybody knows everyone, and everybody's business is everybody's business. Unlike
Mm,
what happens in urban areas where people don't even look at you sometimes. Your neighbors don't even look at you or even greet you. So sometimes there are these stories like my daughter was away taking care of her you know relative who was unwell, now she's back. So there are these stories
mm,
that they give because they don't know how to deal with it. And the shaming and stigma is so huge that it does not just impact the girl, it impacts the entire family. I've met younger
mm,
brothers who were ridiculed in school by their classmates, that your
mm.
sister, yeah, there were certain names given to the sister, and then he refused to go back to school. So it's not just the girl; it's the entire system that needs this sensitization.
Absolutely, and of course, our listeners, you can actually go back to a previous episode where I had spoken to Shinkai Karokhel, who was in fact the former lawmaker from Kabul province, and she spoke about how young Afghan girls today are being sold off by their families for survival, for daily bread. The more grave the crisis, whether it's because of war, whether it's because of sectarian strife, conflict, the chances of this increases a lot, where the first person to be sold off is of course that young girl in the family. Well, this doesn't mean that young boys are not trafficked, that it's only females who are trafficked. Human trafficking spreads across and includes both boys and men as well. And is that something that is not spoken about much, Smita?
Again, it's true. I have not worked, on this area. Maybe I will someday. There are boys who are trafficked from mostly states from the eastern countries or even from UP, Madhya Pradesh, and they are put into horrendous work by these middlemen, whether it is working in a glass factory or a carpet making factory, or any kind of factory which involves a lot of manual work. Child labor is there. It's just not girls, it's even boys who are unfortunately trafficked. I haven't worked in this area, although I maybe one day I will. There are certain states in India, for example, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, a lot of eastern states from the country, from where boys are recruited by these, I would not call them placement agencies, but by these middlemen, and they're brought into, factories, whether it is a glass making factory or a carpet making, industry. They're put, and sometimes they have to work for 16 hours, 18 hours at a stretch with just one break in the middle for lunch. So this happens, this is happening even now. And this is an area where not much is spoken about, as you rightly said.
Just a final question, Smita. As a freelance journalist, as somebody who's been working independently on a lot of sensitive subjects, um, does this also involve you facing a lot of physical threats at time?
Yes. If I say no, I would not be honest. There has been
Mm,
times when I was, you know, I was pulled over by a crowd. In Bangladesh, once when I was working, I had around 200 people who had surrounded me, and I was just with a driver. So
mm,
there are instances that I have faced in many situations. Even in UP, my camera bag was snatched, my purse was torn. There were a lot of fingers at me, and there were some rowdy men who had chains around their fists. So what I do is that I try to keep a very low profile while I'm on the field. I completely change my appearance when I'm working on such sensitive stories, and I don't carry a camera bag. when I'm out for work. I
Hmm.
carry a very dirty looking tote bag and I keep my gadgets inside. I don't want to come across as a photojournalist. I want to come across as just one of them. Most of the times when I go to such sensitive areas and when there are a lot of eyeballs on me asking me questions, I tell them I'm a researcher. I'm working on something. I've come to know about the village life, you know.
Hmm.
So just to put them at ease, but I'm honest with the family that I'm working on. And again, there's something that I think I should mention. If I go to a victim's house directly, there are going to be questions about that family. So I
Hmm.
don't want to isolate them. So what I do is that sometimes I go to that family much later. I walk around the village, I go to the schools, I take photographs, I go to different houses, and I carry a lot of sanitary napkins with me.
Hmm. No,
So
I think it's a very important strategy, and I'm glad and thankful for you, sharing it on this podcast.
thank you so much for having me, Smita.
So, I hope people can go back with a lot of food for thought after this conversation and also introspect on our own individual roles in what we can do to stop this ghastly trafficking that plagues India, South Asia, Southeast Asia, the world really, because the conflicts are not going away, the wars are not going away. Does that mean that human trafficking should actually continue unchecked? Well, that's not what should happen in any world which calls itself a civilized one. Thank you so much. A pleasure talking to you, Smita.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so just don't exit just for. That's all that we have time for on episode 10 of Beyond Nation and State. Do download the Sunu India app and also listen in to all our conversations on the Apple and Spotify podcasts. If you do happen to tune in, please leave your ratings as well as your feedback on the app. You can engage with me on Twitter at Smita_Sharma. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram as Smita Sharma Journalist, and that's the handle of my YouTube station where you can watch the video segment of this podcast later. Thanks for tuning in.